Hi, welcome to Literature Space, and this is the second episode of the history of English literature. As we saw in the last episode, the history of England began even before the English began to settle in England. The Celts were displaced from England and it became the land of the Anglo-Saxons. Monasteries were the center of learning and knowledge. Also later served as the center of drama where the earliest drama got enacted. The Old English period is said to be from 499 AD to 1066 AD. Now speaking of literature, very little was produced during the Old English period, out of which the surviving literature is even less. There are certain theories regarding the quantity of Old English literature. It is believed that the literature during the Anglo-Saxon period was mostly in spoken form, which was passed on for generations, also known as oral literature. It is also important to remember that this literature was produced even before the documentation existed. The other theory is that the documentation later was not possible due to certain linguistic difficulties. Old English was not the language we speak today, but it was a Germanic tongue. It won't be incorrect to consider that more literature was produced during the Old English period than what we know today because the literature was mostly in the oral form. The subject matter of this literature was mostly about war, religion and daily life, which helps us in understanding social life during the Old English period. Moving forward, some of the important texts which we will be discussing today are Beowulf. The original text wasn't named Beowulf, but historians have named it after the protagonist of the text. It is the oldest epic in English. This text is the only text that has survived in a single manuscript partly damaged in fire. The authorship of the text is unknown. It is also one of the most translated texts in history. The story is set in Scandinavia. The story is about a hero Beowulf and is a little like a fantasy story. Beowulf is a hero who fights monsters and saves the nation from beasts and eventually becomes the king of Geats. The story is about Beowulf who helps the Danish king Hrothgar by killing a monster named Grendel that was causing problems to ordinary people in the kingdom. Later, there's an attack by Grendel's mother who wants to seek revenge, and is also eventually killed. Years later, Beowulf confronts a dragon, kills the dragon and he himself dies. But this work also shows Beowulf's qualities like kindness, courageousness, generosity, etc., which is similar to superheroes even today. A fact to remember is that J.R.R. Tolkien wrote an essay on Beowulf called as Beowulf, The Monsters and the Critics, which is the most important work on Beowulf. Now, let's move on to the works of Cadman and Sinwolf. They were probably from the northern part and the poetry written by them has Christian elements. Hence, it was probably written when the Anglo-Saxons converted into Christianity. It is also believed that Cadman died in 680 AD and Sinwolf was born approximately in 720 to 730 AD. But his death year remains unknown. There were other poets too who wrote during this time, but there is not enough evidence to prove that. The most important work of Sinwolf is about a wandering gleeman and lover of pleasure converted by the vision of the cross. Now let's look at some other works during this period. Dior is a poem which has survived and consists of 42 lines. It is about a minstrel or a poet who complains about his life because he is exiled from his former life of luxury and popularity. Another work is The Dream of the Rood with unknown authorship is a religious poem. The rood is the cross on which Christ died and the rood tells its story. The Old English poetry has survived in 4 manuscripts: the Exeter Book, the Junius Manuscript, the Vercelli Book, the Noel Codex. The Noel Codex is also called as Cotton Vitellius Manuscript, that is the Beowulf Manuscript. Now let's talk about the Exeter Book, which was basically an anthology of Anglo-Saxon poetry in the 10th century. Its name is Exeter because it was given to Exeter Cathedral by Bishop Leofric, but we don't know who compiled it. UNESCO has called it as one of the world's principal cultural artifacts and is also the largest collection of Old English literature. To name a few famous poems from the Exeter Book are The Wanderer. It is one of the oldest poems and probably as old as Beowulf. It is about a wanderer, now isolated, who conveys the hardships he has faced in his life. He talks about the death of his lord. The Seafarer. It is a monologue of an old sailor about the hardships and adventures at the sea. Some of the other works in the Exeter Book are The Wife's Lament, The Husband's Message, The Ruin. There are also 95 riddles in the rhyming poems. Now let's move on to the Anglo-Saxon prose, which began in the reign of King Alfred, the Great. He ruled from 871 to 899 AD. He was the patron of art and literature. He also learned Latin and facilitated the translations from Latin to vernacular, which put vernacular to systematic use. He is also popularly known as the translator of Venerable Bede's ecclesiastical history from Latin to Old English. Speaking of features of Old English literature, it used devices such as alliteration, that is the repetition of consonants. There was use of kenning, which is a descriptive phrase. Now let's come to the most important document of the Anglo-Saxon period, which is known as the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. The records of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle are from 60 BC onwards, and the end is with the death of King Stephen in 1154. King Alfred is said to have combined this document. The fragments of this manuscript are now available in the British Library. There are 7 to 9 manuscripts available, but none of them are said to be original. And another interesting fact is that we get the evidence of the existence of poets like Beowulf and Sinwolf. This document is also known to be the link between the Old English period and the Middle English period. Here are some notes from today's class. Feel free to pause the video and read. In the next class, we'll take a look at the Middle English period. Till then, don't forget to read on your own, and don't forget to like, comment and subscribe. That's all for today.